Today on CityCast DC, the Kennedy Center is once again at the center of a fight over its future. Last week, its board voted to uphold its previous decision to close down for 2 years of renovations, while also approving a new inscription crediting Trump for restoring the building. But these plans are far from final. They're still subject to court approval. Washington Post art, architecture, and performing arts critic Philip Kennicott has been closely following the turmoil at the Kennedy Center, and he joins to answer whether closing the center might actually be the best of a bunch of bad options. Today is Tuesday, August 18th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. Before we get into today's conversation, we have some brand new thank you gifts for our CityCast DC neighbors.
These are the folks who join our membership program at $10 a month or $100 a year. They get a lot of great perks like ad-free listening and members-only podcast segments. But they also get swag when they join as a thank you from us. So if you've been looking for a reason to become a neighbor this summer, this is the perfect time. And we think you'll really love these For the Love of DC tote bags that we've got to give away.
So I have one of these tote bags, and I think I told this story on the pod before, but I was at Lyman's and I was carrying one, and somebody said, "What a cool tote bag. Where did you get this?" And I was so excited to say, oh, this is a CityCast DC neighbor original. You can only get them by becoming a CityCast DC neighbor. You cannot buy them in stores. I got to feel very exclusive. And if you want to feel that cool and exclusive next time you're out and about in DC, just become a CityCast DC neighbor. You can do that by going to membership.citycast.fm/DC to snag your tote now while supplies last. And while you're there, you can also check out our other merch and pick out what you want when you become a member. Again, that's membership.citycast.fm/DC. Thank you so much for the support. It really means a lot. Philip, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So last week, the Kennedy Center board voted again to pursue a 2-year closure of the Kennedy Center, even though a federal judge had previously blocked that very same plan. Can you walk us through what exactly happened at that meeting and where things stand now?
Right. So at the most recent meeting, the board reiterated its plan to close the center for 2 years. And I think this really reflects the disastrous straits that the center has been in since Trump took it over in February of 2025. Artists started staying away. There was an audience boycott. And basically, the Kennedy Center had nothing to present. The National Symphony was performing there, but very often the halls were half empty. This was having a really terrible financial impact on the symphony, on the center at large. And I think as a kind of cover, they've decided to renovate for 2 years, which means they can shut down. They don't have to present anything, and they don't have to deal with the embarrassment and the financial losses that come from being basically a toxic institution at this point.
I want to talk a little bit about that because a few months ago, earlier this summer, I remember so vividly what a moment it was when Trump's name was coming off of the Kennedy Center. It was so dramatic. Workers were working up until the very last minute of this deadline. They covered it with a tarp. I personally tuned in to a live stream of that. Now, mind you, this live stream, nothing had really happened yet. It was just workers erecting scaffolding. But when I looked at the amount of people who were also watching that live stream, it was hundreds of thousands of people. And I'm just curious, why do you think the Kennedy Center has sort of become such a symbol that folks like me are willing to tune in to live footage of just scaffolding being erected because that's how much we're locked into what's happening with the Kennedy Center?
Yeah, that was a really fascinating moment. And I was doing the same thing. I kept hitting refresh and going back later and later in the evening to see if the name had come down. I mean, first and most obviously, the Kennedy Center is an internationally known institution. It hosts the Kennedy Center Honors. It's been around for decades. It has a reputation that is well beyond Washington. So I think there was that sense that this was Trump trying to put his name and his stamp on something that was just much bigger and larger than, say, building, a new White House ballroom. The interest and the fascination with that name coming down for me was a bit painful in a way, because I think a lot of people tuned in to see the name come off and they thought, okay, when that happens, the story's over. We've reached a kind of conclusion. In fact, the name came down, but they still want to put it back up. And that's one of the things that they resolved to do in this most recent boardroom. They would like to put, it's a slight change from what it was. It won't be the Trump Kennedy Center. It'll be basically renovated and rehabilitated by Donald Trump, but the name will still be there. And for as long as the name is there, the Kennedy Center is not going to get the audience back that it needs. People in D.C. will not go into that building if Trump's name is associated with it in any way.
I've seen the board's decision to put Trump's name on the building in that roundabout kind of way and close it for 2 years. I've seen this described as a win for Trump, but I was thinking, the board is like full of Trump allies at this point. Was it ever really a question that they were going to vote to do the thing that Trump probably wanted them to do anyway?
Well, sadly, probably not. But what people forget here is that the members of this board are legally obliged to do what's in the best interest of the Kennedy Center and its congressionally chartered mission. They should know that if they put the name up there, that they're going to drive audiences away. So they, as board members, who have a responsibility to the center, are actually acting against its interest. And they should have known that the first time when they voted to put Trump's name on it. So right now, the Kennedy Center is in a terrible place. It's run by people who are not actually running it in the best interest of the American people. And that means that at best, it will be adrift and perhaps fail just from neglect.
Yeah, you make that so clear in your piece for Washington Post. You wrote, Trump could put on a black tie, walk the red carpets of the center's towering corridors, and imagine that he had achieved the social legitimacy that had always denied him by the great cultural institutions of his hometown, New York. Is that really what this whole Kennedy Center thing is about at the end of the day?
I mean, there's a lot of speculation. Certainly, we know enough about Trump's history and his history in New York as a kind of, a sort of nouveau riche parvenu within a world that really prizes kind of establishment connections. And, people speculate about his psychology. There's also a lot of speculation about the fact that during his first administration, when the Kennedy Center honors were announced, a lot of the artists did not want Trump to be there. Traditionally, the president has played a big role in honoring the artists, both at the White House and as an audience member for the actual honors ceremony. Trump stayed away, and so there's speculation that he resented that and that this is a kind of payback to the center. When Trump first took it over, Steve Bannon was very voluble about how this is going to, this is an attack on the cathedral of the secular liberal state, and we're going to take it down. There was a thought of just humiliating the local audiences and the artists that played there. We don't really know what Trump is thinking. He has a lot on his plate. He's building a ballroom. He's building an arch. He's in a quagmire in Iran. Frankly, he doesn't have to do anything if he wants to kill the center. He just has to sit and not pass budgets, and the center will effectively be dead in the water.
You mentioned all of these artists and musicians backing out of their commitments at the center. The Washington National Opera has severed ties. What has this exodus of artists and talent and goodwill done to the center?
Well, it means they don't have much to put on. It means they're, empty halls. And if you're a performing arts institution, a presenting organization, and you can't get people to come and perform in your spaces, you don't really have any reason to exist. We saw Trump in the past year and a half try and fill the spaces with FIFA events, and there have been gatherings for some kind of Christian events in I think the concert hall. But you can't really run a arts center unless you're have full houses. And frankly, you really need enthusiasm. You need that buzz, that spirit, that people want to be there. That there's something magical going on when they walk in the front doors of the Kennedy Center. It hasn't felt that way since Trump took it over, and it won't feel that way again until there's independent artistic leadership and a board that puts the center first.
How badly has all of this hurt the center financially?
Well, we don't know about the center at large because they haven't released those financial statements yet. But the Post got hold of a lot of documentation about the damage to the National Symphony, and it is extraordinary. Ticket sales have plummeted, and the costs have gone up. They're in really bad situation. The only thing that's kept them alive is that they have this cushion that as a an affiliate organization of the Kennedy Center, the way the contracts are drawn, the center has to step in when there are deficits. Now, the deficits don't need to be nearly as large as they've been, but they're large now because they can't sell tickets to people who refuse to go in the building so long as Trump's name is on it.
That's so sad. The National Symphony Orchestra has had this decades-long history with the Kennedy Center. Would you say that they're the institution that has paid the highest price for all of this?
I think, though, the Kennedy Center Opera Orchestra, they're in a terrible situation too. This is the orchestra that specifically plays in the Opera House, and they would play for the Washington National Opera, and now the Washington National Opera has left. But they also used to perform for the ballets that would come through, the big visiting touring organizations. So a lot of their income has dried up. And then there's the Fortis Chamber music program. The damage goes across the board. I think what's particularly sad about the damage to the National Symphony at the moment is that the National Symphony has never played better than it is right now. The current music director, Gianandrea Nozeda, has been there. It'll be his 10th season coming up. And he has built this orchestra into an ensemble of international stature, frankly. And I've been listening to them for more than 25 years. They are playing at an astonishingly high level. It's thrilling to go in and hear them play. It is so particularly sad that the musicians and the administrators and the guests and the artists are having to go through this absolutely unnecessary fiasco at a time when we should really be celebrating them as an institution.
Let's talk about the DC SCU, your friendly neighborhood sustainable energy utility. 15 years and they're still here. Talk about eyes on the prize. Their mission possible. Serving residents with efficiency and clean energy programs, improving affordability and quality of life across all 8 wards. They've delivered $2.2 billion in lifetime savings for district residents and businesses alike. They've prevented 10.1 million metric tons of emissions right here. These are your neighbors working for you. And it makes sense that they're in Southeast by the ballpark because they are knocking it out of the park daily. There is no ivory tower. They're on the sidewalks, out on the streets, and they're at your door, making it happen more capable, more committed than ever. Doing right by you and you and you. I see you standing up. That's right. Clap your hands because DC SCU is 15 and still redefining power in the district. Find out more at dcscu.com. In your piece, you make this really interesting argument about how for a generation of liberal boomer types, the folks who frequent the Kennedy Center, their response to all of this is really kind of bound up with traumatic memories of fascism and upheavals of the 60s. Can you tell me more about how you see that connection?
Yeah, when people were talking about the boycott, there was a big, active debate on social media and among, people who are symphony lovers. And they kept coming back to this name, Wilhelm Furtwängler. Well, Furtwängler was one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century. He was the conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic from the 1920s through the end of the Second World War, and then again for a few years later. Furtwängler made the decision to stay in Nazi Germany. He personally found the Nazis abhorrent. He did make efforts to preserve the ability of Jewish musicians to play. He made some sort of symbolic resistance, but by staying in Germany through Hitler and by performing in Berlin throughout the war, his name became kind of synonymous with collaboration. He's kind of the Quisling of high culture. And a lot of people, the people in their 70s and 80s, they remember names like that. They remember the failure of civic society to resist fascism. And they also remember the 1960s and the boycotts. And I think what happened is that they really felt they had to do something. And they weren't out in the streets like in Minneapolis, but what they could do is just not go. I will never go in that building. I will never frequent the Kennedy Center again. The boycott was the tool they reached for. It was a very blunt tool, and it impacted the National Symphony, which really isn't, under the thumb of Donald Trump. They're fairly independent. There have been virtually no significant artistic compromises that they've been forced to make just because they're a tenant of the Kennedy Center. But they bore the brunt of the boycott. And I argued with a lot of people that there might be ways to go in and demonstrate resistance to Trump while supporting the orchestra as a local institution, as a civic institution, as an institution that we should preserve, because frankly, no one's going to build a symphony orchestra from scratch today if it goes bankrupt.
Yeah, you wrote in your piece about how this boycott kind of became a form of symbolic resistance, but that perhaps it could have been more targeted. What do you think the audience got wrong here?
Well, I think targeting the Kennedy Center, presenting the new Kennedy Center, the people who came in under Trump and the kinds of events they wanted to program, I think targeting those would have sent a fairly clear message to the leaders of the Kennedy Center. Targeting the symphony didn't really send a message to anybody. Trump doesn't care, and the new leaders of the Kennedy Center didn't really care, except for the fact that they were losing some money. The damage really was to the musicians and the institution, which is a local institution. And I think if they had done things more like wear buttons or scarves, something that suggested that people there were united in their opposition to the changes of the center, but not pull the support from the symphony itself, which really had no options. They can't just pull out. They're contractually joined to the Kennedy Center. So I would have tried to do something more targeted if I was, leading a boycott, which I'm not. I'm not supposed to be in that business. But the boycott, as it was affected, turned out to be much more powerfully detrimental to the symphony than it was in any way symbolically important to people like Donald Trump.
And I feel that you tease out this complexity really well in your piece. You write, there are hard choices to be made under authoritarian rule. Do you preserve institutions that can never be rebuilt and that are not wholly corrupted? And I think that's really what you ask. I mean, who does it serve if the orchestra ceases to exist? Yeah, it doesn't seem like that would be something that Trump loses a lot of sleep over at night.
Yeah, and I think that, it's not just orchestras. I think there are people all throughout the federal cultural world right now, whether that's the National Park Service or the National Gallery, who are, or the Smithsonian, any place where there's significant federal dollars and thus significant federal leverage. People are thinking, do I just burn this down and leave? Do we shut the doors and turn off the lights? Or do we attempt to preserve, the best of these institutions so that after a Trump administration, they can be rebuilt and serve their original purpose? There's no science to figuring that out. Ethics is a complex, and it's more about art and in intuition and instinct than it is about knowing exactly where the red lines are for these things. But I think that the value of institutional preservation shouldn't be overlooked, given that a lot of the institutions that Americans take for granted, like the Park Service, like the National Symphony, like the Kennedy Center, these are institutions we will not build today. We simply don't have the political drive or the will or even the money to build institutions like this. So if they go away, they're gone. And then we're living in a different world.
So if the Kennedy Center closes for those 2 years, what happens to the staff? Like, will they be paid?
So a lot of staff have already been laid off and let go. It seems to be kind of a skeleton operation at this point. The key thing to knowing whether or not there is any sincere effort to revive the Kennedy Center and reopen it in 2 years will be if they hire a professional programming staff. And frankly, they need to have those people on board right now, because in the world of arts, 2 years is a blink of an eye in terms of getting some of the bigger organizations to come and visit. If you want to book Hamilton or the Royal Ballet, you need to be working on these things now. So, like I say, the thing to look out for is whether or not they keep some kind of programming staff, and then also a fundraising staff. I mean, they radically sliced down the fundraising staff, and that was another thing that caused irreparable damage to the National Symphony.
In the piece, the headline is closing the Kennedy Center may be the best of bad options. What are the other alternatives in terms of options for the Kennedy Center? And why do you think that this is the least bad one?
So one of the things that the judge did in the earlier decision is he said, you need to come back to me with a little more robust argument about why you need to close. And the Kennedy Center went and they got some consultants, it seems, and they came back and said, well, if we try to do a kind of targeted closure, which is how they've always done renovations of the Kennedy Center in the past, maybe close the concert hall for a bit and work on the Opera House, close the Opera House and work on the Terrace Theater. If you do that, it's going to be like $500 million to do this over 4 to 5 years. If you do it all in one closure, it's going to be $250-some million. I don't know if I believe those numbers, because I don't know if I believe anything that comes out of this administration and the current leadership of the Kennedy Center. But it is reasonable to assume that doing a partial closure and trying to work around the audiences and trying to work when people aren't in the building, that is going to be more expensive. given that there's nothing to present, given that artists don't want to be there, given that the kind of life and magic has gone out of the institution, I accede to the unfortunate conclusion that probably it is best just to close it for 2 years. And if that $250 million can be put to service, like revamping systems, HVAC, electrical, dealing with some of the structural issues, maybe we'll have a functional, viable building in 2 years, and then who knows, perhaps it can be reopened.
So presuming the Kennedy Center does close and then reopen in 2 years' time, what do you think will need to change for folks to get that magic back, for it to feel like there's real culturally impactful programming that people are excited to support?
They need to get Trump's name off the building, and they need to get him off the board of directors, and they need to appoint a nonpartisan board that cares about the performing arts, and they need to hire an executive director who can put together real programming staff. Basically, they need to rebuild the behind-the-curtains part of the institution, the people who make it function day to day. As long as Trump is there, it can't happen. So, it's a simple thing, and it's a sad thing, and Trump's not likely to do it, and his board is not likely to do it. But there really is only one way out, and that is to scrub Trump out of the Kennedy Center.
It's a pretty grim portrait, I think. Do you ever see the Kennedy Center getting back to where it once was? Do you see any of this happening?
I'm pretty sad about it. I go by the building and I feel sad about it. I love Washington. It's been a huge part of my life. I used to spend a lot of my time arguing with the Kennedy Center. They need to do this. They need to do that. They need to be more adventurous. They need to bring this group, not that group. Now I just want to see it survive and continue and be a home for institutions like the symphony, and maybe even be a home once again for the opera company if they can be brought back. I don't see that happening without Trump leaving, and I don't see Trump changing his mind because he doesn't really care.
Yeah, you really put it well earlier, and it goes back to what you were saying about taking institutions for granted. And you can spend all this time hemming and hawing about what they should do. They're not doing this, complaining about that. But ultimately, having them is good. And it's just a good reminder that you really can't take that for granted, because it's not just a given that we will have these institutions.
Yeah, I think, it was hard to imagine how thoroughly Trump could dismantle civic infrastructure. We were having debates about what that civic infrastructure should look like. What should it be engaged with? What programming, what messaging, what side of the political spectrum should it be on? Trump just came in and said, well, let's just get rid of it. If we can't capture it for our own purposes, let's destroy it. And it's pretty easy to destroy and very, very hard to build, which is why it's important that we maintain it. And I think you can see that not just in things like cultural organizations, but also in the built environment, buildings that, the federal government didn't invest in and now are sort of vulnerable to being sold off or taken down. This is a classic thing in democracy. It's really hard for politicians to vote for the unsexy but absolutely essential maintenance of civic infrastructure. Well, it's easy for them to sort of promise and I'm going to give you this or I'm going to take that apart. These big sort of dramatic acts are much more easy to sell.
So what happens next in all this? Does the judge still have to approve this closure?
Yeah, he has to approve it, and I think there's going to be pushback. I don't know whether or not the pushback will be as strong on the closure side as it will be on the attempt to kind of work around the renaming and get his name on the plaza and get his name on the front of the building again. Those parts, the naming part, seem to be fairly obviously illegal, and the judge has ruled on that. And so we'll see whether or not he will put up with this kind of roundabout workaround thing that they're trying to do. I think the closure, what he was asking for before was, can you come up with some numbers on this closure and a way of keeping the Kennedy Center functioning as a memorial to Kennedy? And they've made an argument to do that, and I'm guessing he'll be more open to that than he will be to the renaming.
So I know I can't be the only one who feels like we're in an increasingly complicated and tough situation as a country. Economically, a lot of folks are struggling. We're in this increasingly complicated military situation with Iran. And against this backdrop, I wonder if you have a sense that Trump's base, which, let's be real, we know does not include a lot of district residents, whether or not that base is supportive of Trump's fixation with the Kennedy Center. How do you see this issue playing with diehard Trumpers across the country?
I haven't seen polling specifically on that question, but we obviously see polling on his general popularity, which has plummeted. And we've seen polling on some of his pet projects like the Arch and the ballroom. And these are not popular. My guess is that early on in February 2025, when you had Bannon and other people out there saying, yay, Trump is kind of, taking it to the liberals. He's humiliating them in their own backyard. That may have played well. But people are hurting. They're suffering. We're in a war that does not seem to have an end. Gas prices are high. Inflation is high. Trump is not popular. It's hard for me to see how the kind of performative culture warrior stuff about the Kennedy Center from February of 2025, how that plays as popular today. I suspect this is going to be lumped in with the same sort of grumbling and resentment about $1 billion for this and $1 billion for that, but none of it really adds up to something that impacts my well-being. A little bit lost in the news last week, there's a story of a judge awarding to a musician who had canceled after Trump took over the Kennedy Center, and he awarded him, I think, $250,000. That's a small thing compared to the $250 million budgets we're looking at. But it's a sign of the recklessness. When you don't run an organization well, you're going to end up paying for it. $250,000 there, $250,000 there. They didn't need to do this. They shouldn't have to be paying this, but they do have to pay it to this musician because the judges awarded it to them and they deserve it. So don't make mistakes. Don't be incompetent. Don't hire people whose job, is defined as basically being antagonists to the institutions they're meant to serve. That only makes us pay more in the long run.
I can only hope that Trump is listening because you just dropped some great advice.
I'm sure he is not.
Philip, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That is all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you soon.